It was a sunny Thursday morning in Washington, D.C., and the White House press room was buzzing. Reporters from across the country filled the chairs, laptops open, cameras rolling, and notepads ready. The air was thick with tension. Vice President JD Vance was scheduled to speak. This was his first solo press conference since taking office under President Donald Trump's historic return to the presidency. JD Vance, the best-selling author turned senator, now vice president, had quickly earned a reputation for being sharp, poised, and brutally honest. His unapologetic conservative stance and calm demeanor under pressure had gained him a loyal base of supporters and fierce critics. Some called him a rising star, others labeled him a threat to the media establishment. But today's press conference wasn't about policy, economy, or foreign affairs. At least, that's not what one particular liberal reporter had in mind. Among the sea of press, Leslie Hart, a senior correspondent from a major left-leaning news outlet, was determined to rattle the vice president. Known for her confrontational style and history of digging into politicians' personal lives, she had a plan, and it involved Vice President Vance's wife, Usha Vance. As J.D. Vance stepped onto the podium wearing a crisp navy suit and his signature look of steely confidence, the flash of cameras erupted. He adjusted the microphone and greeted the room. "Good morning, everyone. I'll begin with a brief update on the administration's current economic strategy and then open the floor for questions." He spoke with clarity and vision. His points ranged from investment in American infrastructure to cracking down on cartels exploiting border gaps. It was all meat and potatoes for policy wonks until the Q&A session began. "All right," JD said, nodding toward the first row. "Let's take some questions." Leslie Hart's hand shot up immediately. "Leslie, go ahead," JD called on her, aware of who she was but not yet prepared for the line she would take. She rose slowly, clearing her throat. "Mr. Vice President," she began, smiling politely. "Given the significant role your wife has played in your personal and professional life and the fact that she is a corporate attorney with connections to Silicon Valley, do you feel there's a conflict of interest that should be disclosed publicly?" JD Vance didn't flinch. He'd expected this at some point. "My wife, Usha, is a private citizen and a brilliant legal professional. She has no involvement in government affairs, nor does she hold any political office," he responded calmly. "We've always maintained transparency where necessary, and the Ethics Committee has cleared everything related to her professional life." But Leslie wasn't done. "Sure, but don't you think the American people deserve more answers, especially given the optics of a powerful woman of Indian descent tied to the tech elite, while you criticize big tech?" There were murmurs in the room. JD's expression didn't change, but the fire in his eyes flickered. He knew where she was going with this, and it wasn't journalism. It was a politically loaded trap. "You seem to suggest that my wife's ethnicity or success somehow invalidates my views on big tech's overreach," JD said slowly, locking eyes with her. "Is that really your angle here?" Leslie doubled down. "Well, it's not just her background. There are photos of her at Stanford events with executives now under scrutiny by this administration. Isn't that worth investigating?" Now the room got quiet. Even reporters from left-leaning outlets were slightly stunned. The attack had shifted from politics to something deeply personal. JD Vance placed both hands on the podium and leaned slightly forward. "You know, Leslie," he said, voice steady, "I thought this press conference was about the American people, about the economy, about policy. But if your headline tomorrow is going to be some twisted implication that my wife's race, education, or previous social encounters compromise my judgment, then you're not doing journalism, you're doing character assassination." A hush swept the room. Cameras zoomed in. Leslie opened her mouth again, but JD raised his hand. "I'll get back to that. Let's take another question." He pointed to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, cutting the tension. But the showdown wasn't over. JD Vance continued fielding questions on policy, immigration, and economic revitalization. But the atmosphere in the room had already shifted. Leslie Hart's comments had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. Even reporters who disagreed with Vance's politics felt uncomfortable with how personal the attack had become. Still, JD remained composed, moving from question to question with the efficiency of a seasoned statesman. He had a war veteran's calm, an author's articulation, and a lawyer's precision. But behind the calm, the wheels were turning. He knew Leslie wasn't done, and neither was he. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, Leslie raised her hand again. Despite the initial awkwardness, JD called on her. He wasn't afraid of confrontation. He welcomed it, especially when the stakes were high. "Yes, Leslie?" he said, his voice sharper this time. Leslie adjusted her glasses and stood up with faux restraint. "Mr. Vice President, I appreciate your answers earlier, but with all due respect, transparency is essential. Your wife has ties to law firms that have represented companies involved in privacy lawsuits. Companies this administration is now targeting. Isn't that a conflict?" JD exhaled, took a sip of water, and set the glass down deliberately. "Leslie, my wife is not the vice president. I am, and I think it's fair to say you're trying to draw a conspiracy where there is none. Let me explain something to you, and to the American people very clearly." He straightened up, his voice growing firm. "I come from Middletown, Ohio. I grew up in a broken home. I joined the Marines. I put myself through Yale Law, and I married a woman I love and respect who has worked tirelessly and ethically in her field. If the standard now is that a politician's spouse can't have a professional life of her own without being targeted, then God help us." A few nods emerged from the crowd. Some reporters lowered their pens, sensing a turning point. "And let's talk about what this really is," JD continued. "This isn't about transparency. This is about control. The media can't control me, so they try to guilt-trip me. They can't corner me on my policies, so they go after my family." Leslie interrupted, flustered. "No one's going after your family, Mr. Vice President." "Oh, yes you are," JD cut in. "You've mentioned my wife's race. You've hinted at her career. You've tried to tie unrelated corporate matters to my personal life just because you don't like the fact that we're making waves in DC. And you know what? The American people are tired of it." Silence again. Leslie Hart sat down, face flushed. JD paused, scanning the room. "You all want to talk about democracy? Then let's have a real conversation about the border crisis, inflation, the energy grid, the opioid epidemic. But if your idea of journalism is dragging my wife's name through the mud just to create a clickbait narrative, then you're not serving the country. You're undermining it." There was a long pause. A younger journalist from a Midwest paper raised his hand hesitantly. JD pointed to him. "Go ahead." "Mr. Vice President," the reporter asked, "how do you handle moments like this, when things get personal, when you're under attack not for your policy, but for who you are?" JD offered a faint smile. "You stay grounded," he said. "I remember who I'm doing this for. I didn't come to Washington to make friends with the media. I came here to help the people who feel voiceless, forgotten. My wife supports that mission every day. She doesn't deserve to be collateral damage in someone's agenda." The room erupted in a rare, spontaneous applause, not from the press, but from the few citizens and staffers allowed to observe from the side. The moment wasn't political. It was human. JD Vance nodded, then looked directly at the cameras. "And if the media wants to keep attacking my family to get to me, they better pack a lunch. I'm not backing down." While the exchange between Vice President JD Vance and Leslie Hart dominated the press room, its impact rippled far beyond those four walls. Within minutes, clips began circulating across social media. Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok were ablaze with hashtags like hashtag Vance vs Hart, hashtag Usha deserves better, and hashtag press gone too far. Conservative commentators praised Vance for his dignity and backbone. Even a few centrist voices, normally critical of the Trump administration, admitted the media had crossed a line. But back in the West Wing, JD Vance remained cool. He wrapped up the press conference professionally, answered several more policy questions, and thanked the press corps before heading down the marbled hallway toward his office. Waiting for him inside was his longtime chief of staff, Tyler Green, a sharp, no-nonsense veteran of multiple political campaigns. Tyler stood near the window watching the media frenzy unfold live on a muted TV. "You handled it like a prizefighter, sir," Tyler said, turning around. JD dropped his binder on the desk and removed his jacket. Didn't want to go there, but she kept pushing. "You know what's funny? They call us the extremists, and yet they're the ones digging through my wife's resume like it's Watergate." Tyler nodded. "It's personal because they're losing control. When you start making sense to regular people, that's when they panic." JD sat down, rubbing his temples for a moment. The irony is that Usha's never once asked for the spotlight. She doesn't want it. She's a wife, a mom, a professional. But now she's trending on every platform because someone wanted to score political points. Tyler tossed a manila folder on the table. "You've got requests coming in. Newsmax, The Hill, even The View. They all want a follow-up. Want me to shut them down?" JD smirked. "Let's let it simmer. No interviews. Let the public draw their own conclusions." If we rush into a media tour, they'll spin it as damage control. I'm not apologizing for protecting my wife. As they continued strategizing, JD's phone buzzed. A text from Usha. Saw the press conference. Proud of you. Dinner still on. He smiled. Always. Wouldn't miss it. Meanwhile, across DC, Leslie Hart was back at her newsroom and things weren't going the way she expected. Her producer, a hardened industry vet named Carla Ramirez, sat behind her desk with a tight expression. Leslie, I don't know what you were trying to pull in that room, but the reaction is ugly. Our inbox is flooded. Some of our biggest donors are upset. Even the editor-in-chief is getting heat. Leslie crossed her arms. I asked a valid question. There's always a line between public duty and private influence. Carla leaned forward. You mentioned the man's wife's race on live TV, Leslie. You implied guilt by association. You didn't ask about policy, you went personal. And now you are the story. Leslie opened her mouth to protest, but Carla held up a hand. Drop it. No more questions about Usha Vance. If you push this any further, it'll backfire. Badly. Back at the vice president's residence that evening, JD Vance walked through the door to the warm scent of home-cooked Indian food, Usha's specialty. Their 3 young kids ran to greet him as he stepped inside. Usha stood in the kitchen, a soft smile on her face, dressed in a simple cardigan, her hair tied back. You didn't have to defend me like that, she said as he walked over. JD wrapped an arm around her. I didn't do it because I had to, he replied. I did it because no one gets to question your integrity, not on my watch. They sat down for dinner as a family, the hum of the city far away, replaced by laughter, prayers before meals, and the clinking of dishes. Tomorrow would bring another day of politics and pressure. But tonight, JD Vance was simply a husband and father, grounded, unwavering, and more determined than ever. The next morning, political America woke up to a storm. Headlines across the ideological spectrum were ablaze with the story. Even mainstream outlets that typically tiptoed around media criticism couldn't ignore the tidal wave of public reaction. Vice President Vance defends wife against invasive questioning, sparks national debate on boundaries, The Hill. Too far? Reporter grilled for bringing race, profession into attack on Second Lady, Fox News. Vance clashes with journalist, was it sexist or justified? MSNBC. Cable news shows aired heated panels with pundits on both sides arguing whether JD Vance had gone too far or whether the media had finally pushed someone too far. On one morning show, a liberal host tried to spin the story as Vance overreacting to harmless scrutiny, but even her co-host pushed back. You can disagree with the guy politically, but when you drag a spouse into it and imply they're complicit in corruption just for being married to someone in power, that's not journalism, that's character assassination, he argued. On Capitol Hill, allies of the vice president rallied. Senator Josh Hawley tweeted, JD Vance did what any husband should do, stand up for his wife when she's being smeared. The media should take a long look in the mirror. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik called it one of the most presidential moments she'd seen in years. Even some Democrats treaded lightly, reluctant to appear as though they condoned the targeting of family members, especially one as accomplished and private as Usha Vance. But in the eye of the storm, JD remained unshaken. He spent the morning in briefings, later meeting with President Donald Trump in the Oval Office. Trump, still the sharp and combative commander-in-chief, leaned back in his chair with a grin. You know, Trump said, pointing a finger at JD, that's how you win over America. Not with talking points. Not with scripted nonsense. You were real. You spoke from the gut. That's what they respect. JD nodded. I wasn't planning on going there, sir. But she made it personal. Trump leaned in. And that's when you fight. The American people are sick of the media thinking they can dictate everything, including who we marry, what we believe, and how we live. You turned the tables. The two men discussed policy for another hour, border control, economic zones in the Rust Belt, manufacturing incentives, but even amidst weighty topics, the undertone of solidarity lingered. Later that afternoon, JD appeared at a veterans event in Virginia where he was scheduled to speak. As he walked on stage, the crowd erupted in a standing ovation, more intense than usual. He waved, surprised. An organizer leaned in and whispered, that clip of you defending Usha went viral. You're trending with military families and suburban moms. They're saying you reminded them of what leadership used to look like. JD took the podium and paused. I didn't expect that reaction, he said with a chuckle. I just spoke like any man would who loves his wife and refuses to let her name be dragged through the mud for cheap political gain. Applause. And if that's controversial in today's politics, then maybe we've lost our way more than we thought. I'm not interested in going tit for tat with the media. But I am interested in standing up for the people who stand beside me, not behind me. The speech turned to veterans, but the message stuck. By the time the event ended, the clip had already hit 10 million views. Meanwhile, in a quiet apartment across town, Leslie Hart sat with her laptop open, reading hundreds of emails, most of them critical. Some were thoughtful critiques of journalistic ethics. Others were brutal, condemning her for bringing race and family into a question meant for a policy press conference. One, from a retired school teacher in Pennsylvania, read, "I may not agree with Vance on everything, but I raised 3 daughters. And if anyone spoke about one of them the way you did about his wife, I'd hope they'd defend her the same way. Shame on you." Leslie sat back, a rare moment of reflection sinking in. Had she gone too far? Was it worth it? Days passed, and the firestorm showed no signs of dying down. But something strange had happened. It wasn't just a media moment anymore. It had become a movement. Ordinary Americans across party lines began speaking up about boundaries, bias, and the importance of dignity in public discourse. Talk radio callers, podcast hosts, YouTubers, and influencers began echoing the same message: family is off limits. What struck a chord wasn't just the confrontation, it was how JD Vance responded. He didn't shout. He didn't insult. He didn't dodge. He spoke directly, with quiet strength and an unwavering sense of principle. On a Wednesday night, a widely watched political town hall aired on national television. The host, Brett Lawson, had secured an exclusive sit-down with the vice president and his wife, Usha Vance. It was her first public interview in years, and America tuned in by the millions. The stage was minimal. A simple table, 2 microphones, and the American flag in the backdrop. Brett opened gently. "Usha, thank you for joining us. I know this past week hasn't been easy." She smiled, calm and composed. "Thank you for having me. It's been intense, but also revealing." Brett nodded. "Let's start with the obvious. That moment at the press conference, it went viral. What was it like watching JD defend you like that?" Usha glanced at her husband with a quiet pride. "It was surreal. Not because I doubted he would stand up for me, but because in today's culture, it seems shocking when someone defends their spouse without hesitation. JD did what a good man does. He reminded the country that decency isn't dead." The audience clapped softly. Brett turned to JD. "You could have dodged it. You could have said no comment or pivoted to policy. Why didn't you?" JD leaned forward. "Because silence in moments like that gives power to those who want to rewrite the rules of basic decency. They want us to be afraid to stand up for our loved ones, especially if it doesn't fit their narrative. I won't play that game. I never will." He paused before continuing. "When I married Usha, I promised to protect her. Not just from danger, but from degradation. And when someone implies that her race, her profession, or her identity disqualifies her from being a good person, a loyal partner, or a proud American, I don't stay quiet. I speak up." The clip went viral again. News outlets ran it on repeat. Social media overflowed with comments like, "This is the kind of leadership we've been missing. You don't have to agree with Vance politically to admire how he defends his wife." This was bigger than politics. This was about character. By the end of the week, approval ratings for JD Vance had jumped significantly, not just among conservatives, but among independents and suburban voters, particularly women. Even some liberal columnists admitted that the moment had humanized him in a way no campaign ad ever could. A New York Times opinion piece titled, "In Defense of Defenders," quietly acknowledged that Vance had struck a cultural nerve. The fallout wasn't just political, it was professional too. Leslie Hart's network announced she would be taking a temporary leave of absence. Behind closed doors, it was clear the network was rattled. Sponsors had called. Viewers had turned away. Trust had been bruised. One of her last tweets before going silent read, "Maybe I went too far. Maybe the story became me and not the truth. Time to reflect." And perhaps it was. Because in an age of digital noise, political polarization, and identity wars, one man chose to push back without bitterness, to protect without posturing, and to remind a fractured nation of something it desperately needed to hear. That principle still matters. That family still matters. And that a man who defends his wife with grace and strength might just be the kind of leader America is hungry for. As the sun set over Washington, D.C., JD and Usha Vance took a quiet walk outside the vice president's residence, hand in hand, their children running ahead. The storm had passed. But the message remained.